The heavy rhythmic drumming of a torrential autumn rain beat mercilessly against the towering stained glass windows of Vaughan Manor. Inside the grand foyer, the atmosphere was freezing and completely stripped of any human warmth. The air hung thick with the sharp scent of expensive French lavender polish, old family wealth, and an undercurrent of absolute cruelty. Cardboard scraped against the imported Italian marble floor with a harsh, ugly sound that set Julian's teeth on edge. Julian stood dead center in the cavernous room, his knuckles pale and raw, as he forced a handful of old children's sweaters into a heavy-duty gray plastic bag. He was 34 years old, but the hollow contours of his face made him look like a man who had lived 3 lifetimes of pure exhaustion. His faded paint-splattered tweed jacket and worn denim jeans looked like a permanent stain on the pristine luxury of the estate. His right hand, heavily mapped with pale white shrapnel-like scars from a childhood furnace accident, trembled with a low, constant vibration. Clutched tightly against his ribs was Lily, his 6-year-old daughter. The little girl was completely silent, her small face buried deep into the crook of her father's neck. Her tiny, frail fingers were frantically tracing invisible silent circles onto Julian's scarred right palm. It was their private code, their only remaining language of survival, since the day the world shattered into pieces. Standing exactly 3 feet away on the sweeping mahogany staircase was Eleanor Vaughan, the matriarch of the Vaughan banking empire. She stood wrapped in a cream-colored cashmere shawl, her spine perfectly rigid, and her face frozen in a mask of blue-blooded aristocratic disdain. Beside her stood Charles, her 38-year-old son, who slowly swiveled a crystal glass of single-malt scotch, allowing the ice to clink rhythmically in the suffocating silence. "Let us be entirely transparent." "Julian, Eleanor," said her voice, carrying the practiced icy smoothness of a corporate board member, delivering a liquidation notice. "My daughter, Clara, is gone, and her tragic passing 6 months ago leaves this family with a strict executive duty to clean up her financial mistakes. Your marriage to her was nothing more than an anomaly, a romantic hallucination of an impressionable, young woman who did not understand her own station in life. But the hallucination has ended, and the ledger must be balanced." Eleanor adjusted her shawl, her eyes never dropping to look at the child. Julian did not yell, nor did he deliver a righteous speech about love and loss. He felt a bone-deep tiredness that no amount of sleep could ever fix, a heavy ache left over from months of watching his beautiful wife wither away in a sterile hospital bed. "Clara was my wife, Eleanor." Julian whispered, his voice a dry, gravelly rasp thick with disuse. "We built a life together over 6 years, and Lily is her flesh and blood. You cannot simply erase an entire human existence with a predated legal eviction notice." Charles took a slow, calculated step down the mahogany stairs, his polished leather shoes striking the wood with a dull, authoritative thud. "We are not just erasing it, Julian. We are correcting a systemic error." Charles smirked, his gaze traveling from Julian's mud-stained boots to the heavy roll of gray canvas bat resting against the wall. "Look at yourself. You are a street corner portrait painter, a worthless restorer of dusty old museum fabrics who lives hand-to-mouth on the charity of strangers. Clara's estate, her personal trust, her real estate holdings, and the very roof over your head belong exclusively to the Vaughan corporate vault. Without her, this house is no longer a charity ward for a broken artist and a silent child who is becoming a liability to our public image. You have exactly 10 minutes to clear out of the guest wing before the private security team handles you as a common trespasser." Charles moved closer, his frame projecting the absolute dominance of a man who owned the local judiciary on speed dial. As he stepped past Julian, his heavy leather shoe deliberately came down directly on top of Julian's old wire-rimmed reading glasses, which had slipped from his pocket during the packing. A sharp, sickening crack echoed through the marble foyer as the glass shattered into a dozen jagged pieces. Charles did not look down. He merely took another sip of his scotch, his smile broadening slightly. "Leave the silver trinkets, the expensive blankets Clara bought you, and the house keys on the table." Eleanor commanded, her bloodless lips tightening into a thin line. "The cleaners are arriving at midnight to fumigate the entire West Wing and remove any trace of your presence. If you are found within a 1-mile radius of this grid after 12 o'clock, I will personally instruct our family lawyers to file an emergency petition. The court will declare you a homeless indigent unfit to provide basic shelter, and we will strip you of parental custody before the sun rises." Julian stared at the shattered glass on the floor, his breath hitching for a fraction of a second. He knew fighting them here was a trap, because the Vaughans had a fleet of corporate attorneys and the precinct captain in their pocket, while he had a bank account that was completely frozen. He tied a tight, aggressive knot at the top of the gray plastic bag, his fingers white from the strain. He did not look back at the sweeping staircase, where Clara used to sit and sketch, nor did he look at the grand oil portraits of the Vaughan ancestors, staring down at him with blind, painted eyes. He hoisted the heavy plastic bag over his left shoulder, adjusted Lily against his chest, and bent down with his scarred right hand to grab the long, heavy cylinder of coarse gray canvas bat. It was a greased and dusty roll he had retrieved from the back corner of Clara's old art workshop in the attic, just before the locks were changed. The Vaughan family thought it was nothing more than an old drop cloth left behind by the house painters. An ugly piece of trash, not worth reclaiming. Julian kept his head low, his heavy work boots crunching loudly against the pristine gravel of the circular driveway, as the massive oak double doors slammed shut behind him, echoing like a final gunshot through the dark autumn night. The rusted chassis of the city bus groaned as it slammed into a deep pothole on 7th Avenue. Inside the vehicle, the air was cold, smelling of damp coats, stale vinyl, and the metallic breath of a failing heater. Julian sat near the back, his long legs cramped against the metallic structural bar of the seat in front of him. With his left arm, he held Lily tightly against his ribs, pressing her small frame away from the damp chill vibrating through the window pane. His right hand, wrapped in the coarse fiber of the gray canvas bat, lay heavy on his lap, through the thin, cracked lens of his remaining eyeglass frame. The world outside was a smear of yellow streetlights and dissolving gray rain. The bus was nearly empty, save for a tired night shift nurse, sleeping 3 rows ahead, her head bobbing with every heavy tilt of the wheels. Lily did not move her small fingers, had stopped drawing circles on his scarred palm, and were now tightly curled around his thumb. Her breathing was shallow, a tiny rhythmic puff of warm air against his damp collarbone. Julian stared down at the wet rubber floorboards, watching a stream of dirty rainwater snake its way toward his boots. The words of Eleanor Vaughan hung in the dark space behind his eyes like a row of black iron spikes. An unfit homeless vagrant, she had called him. A street corner painter who lived hand-to-mouth on the volatile charity of tourists. He knew the precise weight of her threat, because the Vaughan name was stamped across 3 municipal bank branches in this district alone. They owned the high-rise offices downtown. They funded the charity galas that the local magistrates attended. And they had an entire floor of corporate lawyers whose only job was to turn human beings into compliance statistics. If he could not establish a verifiable physical address and a stable balance sheet within 48 hours, the family court notification in his jacket pocket would transform from a piece of paper into a legal scythe. They would take Lily from him, not out of love for the child, but to scrub the Vaughan lineage clean of a poor man's name. The bus hissed to a stop at the corner of Logan Street, where the modern brick storefronts ended and the industrial warehouses began. Julian stood up, hauling the heavy plastic bag onto his left shoulder and lifting Lily with his right arm. The canvas bat was clumsy under his armpit, its rough edges scraping against his threadbare tweed coat as he stepped down into the dark. The wind of the river caught them instantly, driving the cold rain straight through the fabric of his trousers. He walked down the narrow alleyway toward a dim orange sign that flickered through the sheet of falling water. The sign read, Starlight Motel, its letter T completely dead, leaving only a broken orange arrow pointing down toward a low concrete building. Every step sent a sharp twinge through his lower back from the days he spent standing before an easel on the damp pavement, trying to catch the faces of passing strangers for $20 a portrait. He carried her past 3 overflowing industrial trash bins, their lids banging in the gale like distant drums. Lily shifted her grip, her small hands sliding up into the collar of his jacket, trying to find a patch of skin that wasn't soaked through. "Don't worry, sweetheart." Julian muttered, his lips barely moving as the rain washed down his chin. "Your father has you. We are almost out of the storm." He pushed open the heavy aluminum door of the motel office, the rusted bell above the frame, letting out a single dull clink. Par tres, room 114 and the silent signals. The key turned in the rusted lock of room 114 with a harsh, metallic protest that scraped against the quietness of the dead alleyway. Julian pushed the heavy water-logged wooden door open with his shoulder, forcing his body into the stagnant warmth of the small square space. The door jamb was swollen from months of winter moisture, leaving a raw 3-inch gap at the threshold where the freezing river draft hissed through like a nest of disturbed vipers. Inside, the dark small room smelt aggressively of 20 years of accumulated stale tobacco smoke, damp cardboard boxes, and a thick layer of industrial-strength floral air freshener that failed to hide the deep rot beneath the floorboards. The intermittent orange glow from the shattered motel sign outside pulsed across the faded floral wallpaper, making the black mold patches in the corners look like spreading bruises. Julian stepped over the peeling linoleum floor, his heavy work boots leaving wet, muddy outlines that slowly pooled in the shallow hollows of the concrete foundation. He laid the long, heavy cylinder of coarse gray canvas bat along the base of the door frame, using its thick, grease-stained weight to block the freezing draft. Lily did not make a single sound as he lowered her onto the center of the sagging mattress. The exposed iron springs beneath the thin quilted cover groaned in a series of sharp, rhythmic squeaks, biting into the silence of the room. Julian unbuttoned his soaked tweed coat, his fingers so thick and rigid from the freezing rain that he had to wrench the plastic buttons through the threadbare loops until one snapped off and fell with a dull click onto the floorboards. He wrapped the oversized coat around Lily's small shoulders, tucking the frayed hem under her boots. The little girl sat perfectly still in the orange shadows, her wide brown eyes entirely blank as they tracked the dust motes floating through the intermittent neon beams. She reached out her small, cold hand, her thumb finding his scarred palm, and began slowly tracing those familiar, rhythmic, invisible circles over the raised white shrapnel marks. It was a slow, deliberate movement, a mechanical gesture she had repeated every single night since the day the hospital machinery had turned into a flat, continuous line. Julian let out a long, ragged breath, his shoulders dropping as he sank onto his heels beside the bed. His hands were shaking now, not from the cold outside, but from the terrifying localized weight of the inventory he was running through his mind. $47 in crumpled bills inside his wet wallet. A canvas bag containing 4 heavy steel carving chisels, 2 horsehair blending brushes, and 3 half-empty jars of gesso primer. That was everything he owned. The Vaughan family lawyers had not just evicted them, they had executed a total financial erasure, filing a non-probate asset freeze before Clara's estate had even cleared the county register. Julian closed his eyes, pressing his forehead against the rough wool of the mattress cover. The family court summon sat like a lead weight in his breast pocket, its formal serif font demanding his appearance in 48 hours to demonstrate sustainable structural independence and verifiable residential stability. If he failed, Eleanor Vaughan would use the local magistrate's signature to place Lily into a specialized, high-security residential academy in Switzerland, scrubbing the child's daily existence from the city. The circle Lily was drawing on his palm grew tighter, her tiny fingers pressing harder against the old pale white scar tissue, as if she could feel the frantic, scattered pulse of his blood beneath the skin. "I am here, Lily," Julian whispered, his voice a flat, granular murmur that barely carried across the damp bedsheets. "I am right here." "They are not going to take you." He stood up, his knee joints letting out a series of dry, audible pops that sounded like breaking twigs in the quiet room. He walked to the corner where the heavy roll of gray canvas bat sat jammed against the leaking copper baseboard. The fabric was thick, an industrial-grade oilcloth he had grabbed from the high rafters of Clara's old brick studio during those final frantic 10 minutes before the security team arrived. He had targeted it simply because he needed something waterproof to wrap his primary leather portfolio. But as he looked down at it now, he noticed how the grease stains on the exterior formed a series of long, regular lines like old shipping markers or warehouse freight stamps from a foreign port. He reached into his pocket for his small horn-handled utility knife, his thumb catching on the nicks in the steel blade as the orange neon sign outside flickered twice and died, plunging the room into absolute, freezing darkness. The total darkness of room 114 was heavy and cold. Outside, the broken neon sign hummed its final dying note before falling completely silent. Julian knelt on the cold linoleum floor, his scarred right hand freezing as it held the small horn-handled utility knife. Beside him on the sagging mattress, Lily's rhythmic breathing remained steady, a thin anchor of life in a room that smelled of waterlogged walls and old tobacco smoke. Suddenly, a tiny, wet scratching sound broke the silence near the base of the swollen wooden door. Julian did not freeze. His years of working in lonely, drafty winter studios had taught him to recognize the movements of the city's small nocturnal scavengers. A small dark shadow slipped through the 3-inch gap under the doorframe, wet fur glinting in the pale moonlight filtering through the window pane. It was a stray one-eared alley cat, its gray coat soaked through and matted with street grease. The animal shivered violently, its amber eyes darting around the dark room until they locked onto the only thick, dry object nearby. It trotted directly over to the long cylinder of coarse gray canvas, but that Julian had jammed against the door baseboard to block the draft. The cat began scratching furiously at the heavy industrial oilcloth, its front claws ripping into the tightly woven protective threads to create a nesting space against the freezing cold. Julian reached out his scarred hand to pull the animal away, but his knuckles struck something completely unexpected beneath the outer layer of fabric. Instead of the soft, yielding fold of a standard painter's drop cloth, his hand met a rigid, unyielding surface that let out a sharp metallic crunch. The cat's claws had sliced through the outer layer of weathered gray canvas, peeling back a strip of grease-stained protective thread. Beneath the rough industrial exterior, a thin gleam of deep indigo and pure silver wire caught the faint moonlight. Julian felt his breath catch in his throat as his artistic memory instantly unlocked a specific, ancient textile density. This was not a mass-produced tarp from a harbor warehouse. The outer canvas butt was merely a sacrificial skin, a heavy-duty weatherproofing sheath, sealed with old-fashioned black cobbler's wax and reinforced copper stitching designed to protect whatever was buried inside from dampness, salt air, and time. He slid the tip of his utility knife into the torn seam, his hand completely steady now as the survival instincts of a professional restorer took over his body. He cut slowly, splitting the heavy outer copper threads one by one, careful not to let the blade penetrate more than a millimeter beneath the protective wax seal. With every inch the knife parted, the heavy, suffocating scent of modern decay in the motel room was replaced by something timeless. The dry, sharp aroma of aged linseed oil, organic mother root dye, and centuries-old mountain wool filled the small space. The one-eared cat sat back on its haunches, its whiskers twitching, as Julian slowly unrolled the first 2 feet of the hidden fabric across the stained floorboards. The deep indigo fibers were so tightly spun, they felt like cold leather under his fingertips, woven with an intricate mathematical precision that only existed before the rise of industrial machinery. Julian stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs as he struck a match, the small yellow flame illuminating the pristine, unruined face of a woven angel staring back at him from the floor. The small match flame flickered violently, casting erratic yellow shadows across the damp plaster walls of room 114 before burning down to Julian's scarred fingertips. He did not flinch from the sudden heat. His entire focus was anchored to the floorboards. With his pocket knife, he sliced through the remaining thick layers of black cobbler's wax, peeling back the heavy gray sheath completely. The coarse industrial batt had done its job perfectly over the years, keeping the inner core dry, untouched, and sealed away from the harsh elements of the outside world. Julian laid his palms flat against the pristine fabric, unrolling it completely across the cold, stained linoleum floor. It was a massive, sweeping masterpiece of antique textile art, the Lost Symphony. The intricate 16th century Flemish tapestry, spread from wall to wall, vibrant indigo, and deep crimson threads shimmering beautifully under the dim moonlight. The hand-spun silk and pure wool fibers were woven with real silver-wrapped threads, creating an ethereal glow that felt completely out of place in the derelict motel room. Julian's artistic eye instantly recognized the brilliant, complex geometry of the celestial maps and royal figures woven into the borders. This was a piece thought to have been destroyed centuries ago, a legendary artifact from the sack of Antwerp that collectors had spent lifetimes chasing in vain. In the exact center of the tightly wound core, Julian's fingers brushed against a cold, rigid object. He pulled out a heavy cylindrical zinc tube, sealed with a watertight copper cap to protect its contents from moisture. With a firm twist of his scarred hand, the threads gave way, releasing a dry, crisp aroma of aged parchment and old ink into the stagnant air. Julian slid the contents out into the faint light, filtering through the window pane. Inside was a thick stack of legal documents, stamped with the official silver crest of a high-end Swiss trust firm, alongside an international insurance certificate from Lloyd's of London. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded the heavy parchment paper, bringing the crisp text inches from his face to read the elegant serif print. The words jumped out at him, sharp and absolute, completely reordering his reality within seconds. Clara had left him a final, monumental defense. The documents detailed that the Lost Symphony had not been lost to history. Clara had used her independent family dowry years ago to privately track down, purchase, and legally restore this singular masterpiece. She had done so entirely through an independent Swiss offshore entity called the Lily Foundation, ensuring that the transaction remained completely invisible to the Vaughan corporate accountants. According to the absolute terms of the irrevocable trust, Julian was named the sole executor and legal owner of the foundation. The certified global valuation of the tapestry, sitting on the dirty floor, was $250 million. 250, cesó. Julian sat back hard on his heels, the breath leaving his lungs in a sharp gasp. But as he turned to the final page of the Swiss financial brief, he realized the masterstroke his wife had executed before her tragic passing. Clara had known the exact structural rot inside her family's banking empire. She knew they were over-leveraged, predatory, and bleeding capital beneath their polished public image. Months before her death, she had quietly utilized the foundation's immense capital liquidity to short the debt of the Vaughan banking group, buying up their toxic assets and converting them into a massive block of guaranteed corporate voting rights. The paperwork in Julian's hands was not a declaration of wealth. It was a pre-loaded financial kill switch, aimed directly at the heart of the Vaughan empire. He looked over at Lily, who was still fast asleep under his Son-Ku tweed coat, entirely unaware that the world was shifting beneath them. He wasn't a broken street painter, trapped in a 48-hour custody countdown anymore. He was a guardian, holding a fortress, and he knew exactly how to dismantle the people who had tried to erase his daughter's name. Port 6, the Swiss. Restitution leveraged the dynamic emotional mountain shifted entirely as the cold morning light filtered through the cracked window pane of room 114. Julian leaned forward over the massive unrolled fabric of The Lost Symphony, his eyes tracing the clean, crisp legal text of the Swiss trust brief. The documents from the Geneva-based wealth management firm did not just declare him an heir. They established him as the absolute corporate proxy for the Lilly Foundation. Every financial clause woven into the parchment was a direct reaction to the predatory banking practices of the Vaughan family. Clara had spent the final 12 months of her life silently executing an economic counteroffensive that her brother Charles had failed to detect. She had identified that the Vaughan banking group was structurally compromised under a mountain of hidden high-risk toxic debt. Using the liquid assets generated by the international insurance policy on the Flemish tapestry, Clara had quietly shorted her family's own institutional credit lines. The papers confirmed that the Lilly Foundation now held the physical bearer bonds to 35% of the Vaughan Group's primary voting stock. Furthermore, the foundation possessed an immediate execution clause to call in the outstanding loans that kept the Vaughan commercial vault from regulatory seizure. Julian ran his scarred right thumb over the embossed silver seal of the Swiss notary, his run hand completely steady now. The numbers staring back at him were monumental, indicating a total liquid asset allocation of $250 million. 250, dedicated solely to his execution. The bone-deep exhaustion that had weighed on his shoulders since the funeral vanished, replaced by a cold mechanical clarity. He looked down at Lily, who had crawled off the sagging mattress and was now quietly watching the one-eared cat sleep on top of the protective gray canvas bat. She looked up at Julian, her silent brown eyes tracking the dramatic change in his facial expression from despair to total resolution. She walked over to him, her small finger reaching out to draw a slow, deliberate circle on his scarred palm, as if confirming that the storm had lost its power over them. Julian pulled his phone from his pocket, checking the countdown on the family court petition. Eleanor Vaughan had served him. He had exactly 36 hours left to prove absolute residential and financial stability to the state or lose custody of his child forever. He didn't speak a single word of panic. Instead, he picked up the watertight zinc tube, slid the parchment bundle back inside, and screwed the copper cap tight. He carefully rolled The Lost Symphony back into its inner protective sheath, ensuring the ancient indigo and crimson threads were shielded from the damp room air. He did not use the rusted pickup truck or call a common taxi. Instead, he used a secure terminal link provided in the Swiss trust brief to log an executive access code. The digital system immediately registered his biometric thumbprint over the scarred tissue, validating his status as the primary trustee. Within 20 minutes, the low rhythmic rumble of a high-end luxury vehicle echoed through the garbage-lined alleyway outside the Starlight Motel. A sleek black Obsidian town car idled outside room on 1th Ford, its polished custom rims cutting through the muddy rainwater puddles. Julian walked out of the room, holding Lily on his left hip and carrying the heavy tapestry cylinder under his right arm. He left the sewn tweed jacket on the motel chair, stepping out into the cold morning air in a simple clean black shirt. The private security driver stepped out of the vehicle, immediately bowing his head with absolute reverence as he opened the rear passenger door. Julian climbed into the pristine, climate-controlled interior, the scent of expensive leather and fresh lilies replacing the rot of the motel. Drive downtown to the offices of Hayes and Croft International. Julian ordered, his tone completely flat and devoid of any hesitation. We have a liquidation to schedule before the courts open tomorrow. The Obsidian black town car glided through the rain-washed streets of downtown, its pristine custom rims reflecting the sharp neon edges of the corporate high-rises. Inside the luxury vehicle, Julian sat in complete silence. His left arm remained wrapped tightly around Lily, who had fallen into a quiet, watchful state. Under his right arm, the watertight zinc cylinder containing the Lost Symphony and the Swiss trust papers felt heavy, cold, and real. The vehicle descended smoothly into the immaculate underground parking garage of a steel and glass tower. The air here was climate-controlled, stripped of the raw wind and damp decay of the industrial docks and the Starlight Motel. The driver stepped out instantly, stepping with sharp, disciplined strides to open the rear passenger door. Julian climbed out onto the polished concrete, lifting Lily onto his left hip. He was no longer carrying his old Sunku tweed coat. He wore only his clean black shirt, his jaw dark with 3 days of stubble, his eyes hyper-focused through the single cracked lens of his reading glasses. They entered the private elevator bay, ascending directly to the penthouse floor of Hayes and Croft International law firm. When the heavy bronze elevator doors slid apart, the sudden shift in environment was jarring. The sprawling lobby smelled of premium beeswax, fresh white lilies, and ancient institutional money. Pristine white marble floors stretched toward a massive mahogany reception desk, behind which sat a severe woman with a tight, flawless blonde chignon. The receptionist, typing, stopped the exact millisecond Julian's worn work boots stepped onto the white marble floor. Her eyes darted instantly from his mud-stained leather footwear up to his scarred right hand, then to the silent child clutched against his chest. A look of practiced condescension settled over her face as she rested her hand near the security encom button beneath her desk. "Sir, deliveries must go through the loading bay around the back of the building," the receptionist said, her tone dripping with passive-aggressive corporate authority. "This floor is strictly reserved for private, pre-scheduled clients of our senior managing partners. I must ask you to leave immediately before I call building security to escort you out." Julian did not answer her with an explanation, nor did he step back. He walked directly up to the massive mahogany desk, the dull, rhythmic thud of his heavy boots echoing loudly through the cavernous lobby. With his scarred right hand, he pulled the deep blue velvet folder from the zinc tube and dropped it flat onto the pristine surface. The heavy leather binder struck the wood with a sharp sound that shattered the quiet atmosphere of the room. "Tell David Croft that the sole trustee of the Lily Foundation is standing in his reception lobby," Julian said, his voice entirely flat, cold, and devoid of any emotional hesitation. "And notify him that we are executing the immediate liquidity option on the Vaughan banking group, effective as of this morning." The receptionist's finger hovered over the security button, but her gaze instinctively dropped to the embossed silver seal of the Geneva Wealth Management Firm. stamped on the front of the velvet binder. She blinked once, twice, as her professional training recognized the specific international trust mark. Her face drained of color within seconds. She pulled her hand back from the security switch as if it had burned her, frantically lifting the internal telephone receiver with trembling fingers. She spoke into the mouthpiece in a hurried, terrified whisper, her eyes never leaving Julian's calm, unblinking face. Less than 90 seconds later, the heavy frosted glass doors at the back of the lobby swung open violently. David Croft, the legendary senior partner of the firm, a man who regularly negotiated multi-billion-dollar state treasury bonds, practically sprinted into the reception area. His bespoke charcoal, three-piece suit was immaculate, but his forehead was slick with a thin layer of sweat as he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Julian standing there in his paint-stained jeans. He looked down at the velvet folder, then up at the scars on Julian's hand, his eyes widening with absolute reverence. "Mr. Thomas?" David Croft breathed, his voice cracking slightly as he stepped forward, extending his hand with total humility. "We have been searching for you through every classified military and artistic register for 3 years. Your late wife's international instructions were locked under a Level 1 Swiss security clearance. Please, I beg you, bring the child and follow me into the main boardroom immediately." The large mahogany conference table inside the executive boardroom of Hayes and Croft was covered in clear plastic protection sheets to prevent any grease or moisture from Julian's heavy cylinder from touching the finish. David Croft did not sit down. He paced along the perimeter of the glass wall, his personal cellular device pressed tightly against his ear, while 3 junior associates stamped legal documents. The air in the room was climate-controlled and cool, but the rapid movement of the staff created a tense, suffocating energy that made the space feel small. Julian sat completely still in a low leather chair, his long legs stretched out and his scarred right hand resting flat on top of the zinc tube. Lily sat on the floor beside his boots, quietly coloring a scrap piece of drafting paper with a single blue oil crayon Julian had kept in his pocket. She did not look up at the rushing assistants, nor did she flinch when the heavy industrial printers in the corner began producing hundreds of sheets of financial analysis. "Mr. Thomas, we have a structural confirmation," David Croft said, dropping his phone onto the table and sliding a heavy folder across the surface. "Your late wife's arrangements with the Geneva Depository were executed with absolute precision 3 years ago during her private asset restructuring. The collective market valuation of the Lost Symphony has been updated by the International Insurance Syndicate at Lloyd's of London to exactly $250 million. 250,000. Because that asset was placed inside the irrevocable structure of the Lilly Foundation, it is completely immune to the domestic probate freeze that the Vaughan family lawyers attempted to enforce last night. Julian leaned forward, his eyes narrowing behind the single cracked lens of his reading glasses as he scanned the first 3 pages of the audit. "And the equity leverage?" Julian asked, his voice dropping into that flat, cold register that made the junior associates stop their stamping. "It is active," Croft replied, his finger tracing a long column of liabilities on the ledger sheet. "The Vaughan Banking Group is currently facing an extreme liquidity deficit due to their overextension in commercial real estate bonds downtown. They are short $42 million for their mandatory Federal Clearing Reserve before the closing bell at 3 o'clock today." Clara knew this day would come because she managed their internal risk analysis before her brother Charles stripped her of her executive title. She deliberately authorized the Lilly Foundation to purchase $88 million of their outstanding debt notes through a Swiss secondary market. You do not just own their debt, Julian. You own the underlying collateral, which includes 40% of their corporate voting shares, and the physical title deed to Vaughan Manor itself. Julian closed the folder with a sharp, dry click that cut through the sound of the air conditioning unit. He looked down at Lily, who had finished her drawing, and was now tracing a perfect silent circle onto the rough leather of his boot toe. The image of Eleanor Vaughan, standing on the marble staircase, pointing her finger toward the storm, flashed behind his eyes like a visual threat. They thought they were scrubbing a poor man from their ancestry by dumping his life's work into an alleyway. They did not realize they had handed him the exact crowbar needed to dismantle their foundation. Execute the immediate margin call. Julian ordered, standing up, his spine locking into perfect alignment. I want a formal freeze placed on all corporate spending accounts associated with Eleanor and Charles Vaughan within 30 minutes. Draft the emergency temporary injunction for the family court to dismiss their custody petition based on active institutional fraud. Croft bowed his head, his hand already reaching for the telephone receiver. The papers will be filed digitally within 12 minutes. Sir Croft said, his voice filled with professional reverence. Our corporate transport fleet is idling in the basement bay. We should arrive at the Vaughan banking headquarters exactly 20 minutes before their regulatory deadline. Julian lifted Lily onto his hip, his scarred hand securing her small frame against his chest. Let's go, sweetheart, he whispered into her dark hair. We are going to pick up the rest of your mother's things. The heavy double oak doors of the Vaughan Banking Group executive boardroom did not just open. They bounced hard against the reinforced brass magnetic stoppers. The sudden thunderous crack of wood against metal cut through the low, anxious murmurs of 30 corporate board members like a physical blade. Inside the long room, the air was climate-controlled to a freezing temperature, but the atmosphere was suffocating, smelling of old paper mills, burnt espresso, and the cold sweat of a corporate empire facing total collapse. Eleanor Vaughan sat at the absolute head of the massive obsidian glass conference table. Her fingers clutched around a gold-plated pen with such manic intensity that her knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white. Beside her, Charles was pacing along the length of the floorboards, his custom silk tie loosened at his throat, and his face flushed a dangerous, mottled purple. He was shouting into a secure landline receiver, his voice cracking under the pressure of the clock. Ticking toward the mandatory 3 o'clock, Federal Reserve clearing deadline. If the emergency credit facility from the Geneva Syndicate does not clear our account within the next 15 minutes, our trading license is dead. Charles screamed, slamming his fist onto the glass table, making the crystal water carafes rattle. Every asset we hold will be seized by the regulators by sunrise. We are completely blind out here. Eleanor did not look up at her son. Her eyes were locked onto the massive wall-mounted terminal screen, showing the plummeting liquidation index of their primary commercial real estate portfolio. We do not kneel. Charles, Eleanor said, her voice a low, freezing whisper that carried across the long table like dry winter wind. The Vaughan name has survived 3 recessions. We will buy our way out of this deficit, just as we always have. Julian stepped over the threshold, his heavy work boots striking the pristine white hardwood floor with a slow, deliberate cadence that instantly drew every eye in the room. He had stripped away the damp clothing of his old life, stood tall in an immaculate, dark charcoal wool suit that perfectly framed his wide shoulders. His jaw was clean-shaven, and behind the new, clear lenses of his reading glasses, his eyes held a dead-end, calculated calm that terrified the younger board members. Clutched tightly against his chest was Lily, her small face quiet and steady as she looked out at the room full of executives. Behind Julian marched a phalanx of 6 senior international attorneys from Hayes and Croft, their black leather briefcases held tight against their ribs like shields. What is the meaning of this intrusion? Eleanor shrieked, her chair scraping violently backward as she stood up, her hand pressing against the cream cashmere shawl at her chest. Julian, you are a common vagrant, a trespasser, under active eviction. Security, where are the guards? Drag this man and his liability of a child out of my sight immediately. Charles dropped the landline receiver. It swung by its black cord against the wall, like a dead pendulum. You have exactly 5 seconds to get out of this boardroom before I ensure you spend the next 10 years in a federal cell. Julian, Charles roared, stepping forward. His hands bolted into shaking fists. David Croft stepped out from behind Julian's shoulder, his tall frame cutting off Charles' path as he calmly unzipped a heavy blue velvet portfolio folder. Control your language, Mr. Vaughan, David Croft said, his voice carrying the immense, crushing weight of an international enforcement mandate. You are not addressing a trespasser. You are addressing the sole executor of the Lilly Foundation, which, as of exactly 12 minutes ago, holds the primary debt certificates and 60% of the voting shares of this financial institution. Croft slammed the stack of certified Swiss regulatory orders flat onto the center of the obsidian glass table. The heavy papers slid across the polished surface, striking Charles' crystal glass and knocking it over, allowing the amber liquid to spill out like grease across the legal text. Charles did not look at the spill. His eyes were glued to the silver-embossed seal of the Geneva Wealth Fund at the top of the page. His knees gave way instantly, and he dropped hard into his leather rolling chair, his mouth hanging open as his corporate bluster evaporated into thin air. This is impossible, Charles mumbled, his hand shaking violently as he pulled the documents closer, his eyes scanning the liquidation clause. The foundation, the entity that shorted our commercial bonds. It's all registered under his name. Mother, he doesn't just own our debt. He owns the building we are standing in. Charles held the damp legal brief in his hands, his fingers leaving dark smudges across the wet parchment as the reality of the numbers forced its way into his mind. The silence in the executive boardroom was so heavy that the rapid, short breathing of the 30 seated board members sounded like a low hum of panic. Eleanor Vaughan did not slide her documents over. She snatched the central ledger from Charles' trembling hand, her eyes scanning the Swiss corporate stamp with sharp desperation. This is a fraud, Eleanor whispered, her voice tightening as she stared directly at Julian's cold, clear reading glasses. You are an illiterate street corner artist, a common nobody who painted for scraps under the railway arches downtown. You do not possess the structural capacity to handle an international asset short, nor do you have the standing to touch a municipal banking vault. David Croft stepped closer to the head of the obsidian table, his hand resting on the silver handle of his briefcase. Mrs. Vaughan, the legal execution of the Lilly Foundation was finalized in Zurich 6 months before your daughter's cardiac arrest, Croft said, his tone flat and formal. Your daughter, Clara, was the chief risk analyst for this entire group, and she filed 3 independent non-disclosure audits regarding your overextension in the commercial real estate sector. She legally transferred her entire ancestral dowry out of your system because she knew you were using high-risk corporate debt to fund your private estate downtown. Julian did not look at the board members. His eyes remained on the small drawing. Lily was finishing on his sleeve. He reached down, his scarred right hand removing a small platinum corporate keycard from his suit pocket and sliding it into the main diagnostic terminal of the boardroom table. The terminal immediately emitted a high-pitched chime, the screen flashing from the dropping stock index to a solid dark blue interface bearing the words, "The Lilly Foundation. Access granted. As of 3 o'clock, the Federal Clearinghouse has registered our asset injection," Julian said, his voice dropping into a calm, mechanical register. The $42 million deficit that was about to break your trading license has been covered entirely by my foundation's liquid reserve. But, under the terms of the Emergency Capital Recovery Act, that injection triggers an automatic restructuring of the Vaughan banking group's internal hierarchy. He looked up, his gaze locking onto Charles, whose face had gone completely gray. Charles Vaughan, your position as Chief Executive Officer is terminated as of this second. Julian continued, his words short and sharp. Your corporate credentials have been deactivated from the main database. Your company vehicle has been reassigned to our legal logistics pool, and your security clearance is dead. You have exactly 5 minutes to empty your desk before the audit team logs your hard drive for active financial negligence. Charles looked around the long table, his eyes begging the junior partners for an objection,